Moscow, 1957. In a smoke-filled conference room deep inside Lubyanka, the granite fortress that housed the Soviet Union's most feared intelligence agency, senior KGB analysts gathered around a mahogany table scarred by decades of cigarette burns and nervous fingers. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the peculiar tension that comes when powerful men discuss the impossible. Colonel Ivan Petrov, a veteran of Stalin's purges who had survived by being right more often than wrong, held up a translated American intelligence report. His weathered face cracked into what might have been a smile. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the gravelly authority of a man who had interrogated enemies of the state for 20 years, "the Americans have lost their minds." Laughter rippled through the room, not the polite chuckles of bureaucrats, but the genuine mirth of professionals who had just heard the most ridiculous joke of their careers. The report spoke of orbital reconnaissance platforms and space-based intelligence gathering. To these men, who had built their reputations on networks of flesh and blood informants, on dead drops and secret handshakes, the very idea was absurd. "There's nothing up there but stars," Petrov continued, crushing his cigarette into an ashtray already overflowing with the remains of a long meeting. "What do they plan to do? Train cosmonauts to peek through telescopes?" But above those stars, something new was stirring. In laboratories across America, engineers were bent over blueprints that would have seemed like fantasy to the laughing men in Lubyanka. They spoke in hushed tones of cameras that could see through clouds, of film capsules that would plummet from the edge of space, of mechanical eyes that never blinked, never tired, never asked questions about orders. Within just a few years, those eyes would open. They would pierce through the Iron Curtain as if it were made of mist. They would count Soviet missiles like a child counting toys, map submarine bases hidden beneath Arctic ice, and capture entire military installations in frames of black and white film that would reshape the balance of global power. The satellites would see everything: troop movements masked by winter fog, nuclear facilities disguised as power plants, the precise locations of intercontinental ballistic missiles that the Kremlin believed were invisible to Western intelligence. Every detail would be recorded, cataloged, analyzed by minds that the KGB never knew existed. And by the time the men in Lubyanka realized it wasn't science fiction, by the time they understood that the sky itself had become America's greatest spy, their every secret would already be exposed. The age of human intelligence, of patient infiltration and careful cultivation of assets, would give way to an era of mechanical omniscience that would make the old ways seem as primitive as smoke signals. This is the story of how disbelief became downfall, how the race to control the heavens began a war that no one could hide from, and how a handful of men who thought they were gods discovered they were being watched by something far more powerful than any earthly intelligence service. It's the story of the moment when espionage escaped the bounds of Earth and the Cold War moved into orbit, forever. In the winter of 1957, the Soviet Union's intelligence apparatus was the envy and terror of the world. The Komitet Gosudarstvennoy Bezopasnosti, the Committee for State Security, known by its chilling initials KGB, operated the most extensive human intelligence network in history. From the foggy streets of London to the crowded bazaars of Cairo, from the corridors of the Pentagon to the coffee shops of Paris, Soviet agents moved like shadows through the Western world. They were masters of the ancient art of espionage, the delicate dance of recruitment, betrayal, and information that had shaped human conflict since the first spy whispered the first secret. These were not the glamorous operatives of cinema, but patient craftsmen who measured success in years, sometimes decades. A professor recruited at Oxford might not provide useful intelligence until he reached the highest levels of the British government 20 years later. A secretary befriended in Washington might slowly, carefully, be guided toward positions of greater access and influence. Colonel Yuri Nosenko, one of the KGB's most accomplished recruiters, understood this patience better than most. Sitting in his office on the third floor of Lubyanka, surrounded by files thick with the patient work of human manipulation, he embodied the Soviet approach to intelligence. "Americans think in quarters," he would tell his subordinates. "We think in generations." The KGB's success rested on a fundamental understanding of human nature, that every person had a price, whether measured in money, ideology, revenge, or simple human weakness. Their officers were trained psychologists as much as spies, capable of identifying the hairline cracks in a person's loyalty and applying just the right pressure to widen those cracks into chasms. This was the world that Colonel Petrov and his analysts inhabited, a world where information flowed through human channels, where secrets were whispered in bedrooms and passed in folded newspapers, where the greatest intelligence coups came from turning an enemy's own people against them. It was a world that had served the Soviet Union well through the chaos of World War II and the early years of the Cold War. So when the reports began filtering in from their American assets about something called space-based reconnaissance, the reaction was predictable. These were serious men who dealt in serious things: nuclear weapons programs, military deployments, political scheming at the highest levels of government. They had no time for what sounded like the fantasies of science fiction writers. The irony was that science fiction had, in fact, prepared the ground for what was to come. In the pages of Amazing Stories and Galaxy magazine, writers had long imagined mechanical eyes in space, watching and recording everything that moved on the Earth below. But to intelligence professionals trained in the messy realities of human espionage, such fantasies seemed laughably naive. "Have you read what the Americans are saying?" asked Major Vladimir Kozlov during one of the regular briefings that winter. He was a younger officer, part of the generation that had come of age during the paranoid final years of Stalin's rule, and his skepticism was tinged with the particular contempt that the young reserve for ideas they consider outdated. "They claim they will put cameras in orbit that can photograph our missile sites." Cameras! As if a machine floating in space could do what it takes our best agents years to accomplish. The room erupted in knowing laughter. These men understood the complexity of intelligence work in ways that no civilian ever could. They knew how many human assets it took to confirm even basic facts about enemy capabilities. A single report about a new weapons system might require verification from multiple sources. A scientist with access to technical specifications, a factory worker who could confirm production schedules, a transportation official who could track shipments of components. The idea that all of this careful human intelligence could be replaced by automated cameras floating hundreds of miles above the Earth seemed not just unlikely but fundamentally misguided. How could a machine distinguish between a real missile and a decoy? How could it penetrate the elaborate camouflage and deception programs that the Soviet military had perfected over decades? How could it provide the kind of context and interpretation that came only from human sources with deep access to their targets? But what they didn't know yet, what none of them could have imagined in that smoke-filled room, was that on the other side of the world, American engineers were asking completely different questions. Instead of wondering whether machines could replace human intelligence, they were asking whether human intelligence had reached its practical limits in an age of nuclear weapons and continental-scale military deployments. 3,000 miles west of Lubyanka, in the sterile corridors of CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, a very different kind of meeting was taking place. The participants spoke in the same hushed tones that characterized intelligence work everywhere, but their concerns were radically different from those occupying the KGB's analysts. Richard Bissell, Jr., the CIA's deputy director for plans, stood before a wall-sized map of the Soviet Union, its vast expanse marked with question marks and uncertain estimates. Bissell was a tall, scholarly man who had made his reputation managing the Marshall Plan's complex logistics, bringing to intelligence work the systematic thinking of an economist and the imagination of an engineer. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying none of the casual confidence that had characterized the scene in Moscow, "we have a problem that human intelligence cannot solve." He gestured to the map, where red pins marked known Soviet military installations and blue pins marked suspected ones. The blue pins vastly outnumbered the red. The Soviet Union is a closed society spanning 11 time zones. Traditional espionage, even at its most successful, gives us fragments of information about fragments of their capabilities. We're trying to assess their nuclear threat by looking through keyholes. The assembled CIA officers understood the magnitude of the challenge in ways that their Soviet counterparts, secure in their closed system, could not. America was an open society where Soviet intelligence could operate with relative freedom. A patient KGB officer could read American newspapers, attend public hearings, cultivate contacts in government and industry, even obtain official documents through legal channels. The reverse was not true. Western intelligence officers attempting to operate inside the Soviet Union faced a totalitarian system designed to detect and eliminate foreign spies. More critically, the stakes of ignorance had risen to unprecedented levels. During World War II, intelligence failures might cost battles or campaigns. In the nuclear age, intelligence failures could cost civilizations. The United States needed to know not just what weapons the Soviets possessed, but where they were located, how many existed, and how quickly they could be deployed. Traditional espionage, no matter how skillfully conducted, could not provide this kind of comprehensive, real-time strategic intelligence. Dr. Edwin Land, the brilliant inventor of instant photography and scientific advisor to the CIA, had been arguing for months that the solution lay in technology rather than human assets. "We're still fighting the intelligence wars of the 1940s, he told Bissell during one of their regular consultations. But the security challenges we face require the tools of the 1970s, tools that don't exist yet, but can be built if we have the vision and the will." Land's proposal was radical. Instead of trying to infiltrate Soviet society with human agents, America should transcend that society entirely by moving intelligence gathering into space. Satellites equipped with sophisticated cameras could photograph the entire Soviet Union on a regular schedule, providing the kind of comprehensive surveillance that no network of human spies could ever achieve. The concept of space-based reconnaissance was not entirely new. Military theorists had speculated about the intelligence applications of artificial satellites almost as soon as rocket technology made such satellites theoretically possible. But theory and practice were separated by enormous technical challenges that seemed to render the concept impractical, if not impossible. How could cameras designed for terrestrial use function in the vacuum of space, subjected to temperature extremes that ranged from hundreds of degrees above zero in sunlight to hundreds of degrees below zero in shadow? How could film be processed in zero gravity and returned to Earth for analysis? How could satellites be positioned and controlled with sufficient precision to photograph specific targets thousands of miles below? These questions had practical answers, but they required innovations that pushed the boundaries of 1950s technology. The cameras would need new optical systems, new stabilization mechanisms, new methods of thermal control. The satellites would need guidance systems more precise than anything that had ever been built. The film return systems would require heat shields, parachutes, and mid-air recovery techniques that had never been attempted. Each challenge seemed solvable in isolation, but the combination created a level of complexity that daunted even America's most experienced aerospace engineers. Werner von Braun, the former German rocket scientist who had become America's leading expert on space technology, estimated that a functional reconnaissance satellite would require technological advances equivalent to those that had taken the aviation industry 3 decades to achieve. But Bissell and his team had advantages that their Soviet counterparts lacked. America's open society, for all its security vulnerabilities, fostered exactly the kind of innovative thinking that space-based reconnaissance required. Companies like Lockheed, Rand Corporation, and E-Tech Corporation were already conducting advanced research into miniaturized cameras, precision optics, and satellite control systems. The theoretical foundations for orbital reconnaissance existed. What was needed was the will to transform theory into reality. President Eisenhower, a former military commander who understood both the promise and the limitations of traditional intelligence, provided that will. In a series of secret meetings during the spring of 1958, he authorized what would become known as the Corona Program, America's first attempt to build a space-based intelligence capability that could see through the Iron Curtain from orbit. Back in Moscow, The KGB's analysts remained blissfully unaware of the revolution taking shape across the Atlantic. Their attention was focused on more immediate concerns: the management of existing human assets, the analysis of intelligence gathered through traditional channels, the constant cat-and-mouse game of espionage and counter-espionage that had defined their profession for generations. When reports of American space reconnaissance programs appeared in intercepted communications, they were filed alongside other examples of Western propaganda and disinformation. Colonel Petrov, whose initial mockery had set the tone for the KGB's dismissal of satellite intelligence, became even more convinced that the Americans were engaged in an elaborate deception campaign. "They want us to waste resources chasing fantasies," he explained to a gathering of senior officers in late 1958. "While we're building rockets to photograph empty space, they'll be expanding their real intelligence networks on the ground." This analysis seemed so obviously correct that it required no further discussion. The Soviet Union's own space program, then in its triumphant early stages following the success of Sputnik, was focused entirely on scientific research and national prestige. Soviet engineers were working on putting men in space, not cameras. The idea of using satellites for intelligence purposes was so foreign to their thinking that they didn't even bother to classify their early space launches, a decision they would later regard as one of the greatest security failures in their history. Even when American magazine articles began describing the theoretical possibilities of space-based reconnaissance in increasingly specific detail, the KGB dismissed them as science fiction masquerading as serious analysis. They had no framework for understanding how mechanical systems could replace the subtle human intelligence that had served espionage agencies for centuries. But what they didn't realize, what none of them could have anticipated, was that mechanical systems weren't replacing human intelligence. They were transcending it entirely, moving intelligence gathering into a realm where human agents couldn't follow, where traditional counterintelligence techniques were useless, where the very concept of secrecy would have to be redefined. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, a basketball-sized satellite that orbited the Earth every 96 minutes, broadcasting radio signals that amateur radio operators around the world could hear as clearly as their favorite music programs. The achievement was a triumph of Soviet engineering and a devastating blow to American technological prestige. But as KGB analysts celebrated their country's space triumph, they failed to grasp its implications for their own profession. Sputnik proved that artificial satellites were not science fiction, but engineering reality. More importantly, it demonstrated that objects placed in orbit could observe the Earth from a perspective no human intelligence agent could ever achieve. In Washington, President Eisenhower listened to Sputnik's radio beeps with very different emotions than those felt in Moscow. The satellite's existence proved that space-based intelligence was possible. Its Soviet origin made it urgently necessary. If the closed society of the USSR could put machines in orbit, then America had no choice but to follow, and to do so with capabilities that far exceeded simple radio transmission. The race to control space-based intelligence had begun, though only one side knew they were racing. In the conference rooms of Lubyanka, senior KGB officers continued to laugh at American space fantasies, even as the evidence of their reality passed overhead every hour and a half, broadcasting the future of espionage to anyone with a radio receiver and the imagination to understand what they were hearing. Within months, that future would take concrete form in American laboratories and launch facilities. Engineers were already working on cameras that could photograph objects smaller than automobiles from altitudes of more than 100 miles. Film recovery systems were being tested that could return those photographs to Earth with greater precision than mail delivery. Guidance systems were being perfected that could point those cameras at targets with accuracy measured in feet rather than miles. The age of space-based intelligence was about to dawn, and when it did, the laughter in Lubyanka would die forever. The men who had built their careers on understanding human nature were about to discover that in the realm of espionage, human nature itself was becoming obsolete. The morning after Sputnik began its lonely orbit around Earth, President Dwight D. Eisenhower woke to a changed world. Across America, citizens stared up at the dawn sky, knowing that somewhere in that vast blue expanse, a Soviet machine was passing overhead every 96 minutes, watching, listening, broadcasting the triumph of communist technology to the world below. The political humiliation was immediate and devastating. Headlines screamed about American technological inferiority. Editorial cartoons depicted Uncle Sam looking up nervously at menacing Soviet satellites. Congressional leaders demanded investigations, explanations, and immediate action to close what senators called the space gap. But behind the closed doors of the White House, Eisenhower's concerns were more specific and far more urgent than public embarrassment. If the Soviets could put Sputnik into orbit, they could put anything into orbit, including nuclear weapons. The same rocket technology that had launched the world's first artificial satellite could deliver hydrogen bombs to American cities with no advance warning and no possibility of interception. The balance of terror that had maintained an uneasy peace since the end of World War II was shifting, and America was on the wrong side of that shift. But Eisenhower, who had commanded the largest military operation in human history during the D-Day landings, understood that panic was the enemy of effective action. Instead of rushing to match Soviet achievements in space spectacle, he authorized a response that would prove far more revolutionary: the development of America's first space-based intelligence system. The project received the code name Corona, after the crown-like solar prominence visible during eclipses, a fitting name for a program designed to give America a god's-eye view of Soviet military capabilities. Unlike the Soviet space program, which sought to demonstrate national prestige through visible achievements, Corona would operate in absolute secrecy, its very existence known only to a few dozen individuals at the highest levels of government and industry. Richard Bissell, tasked with transforming satellite reconnaissance from theory to reality, faced engineering challenges that seemed to multiply with every attempt to solve them. The basic concept was elegantly simple: place a camera in orbit, photograph Soviet military installations, return the film to Earth for analysis. The execution required innovations in dozens of technologies that had never been attempted. The camera system alone represented a revolution in optical engineering. Traditional aerial reconnaissance cameras, designed for use in aircraft flying at altitudes of 50,000 feet or less, were useless for space-based photography. A satellite orbiting at 100 miles above Earth needed optical systems powerful enough to distinguish objects the size of automobiles while traveling at speeds of nearly 18,000 miles per hour. Dr. James Baker, the Harvard astronomer recruited to lead Corona's optical development, described the challenge in terms that revealed its unprecedented nature. "We're trying to read a newspaper from the top of Mount Everest while riding on the back of a cheetah. The camera would need a telephoto lens with a focal length of more than 3 feet, mirrors ground to tolerances measured in millionths of an inch, and stabilization systems capable of maintaining perfect focus while subjected to the vibrations and thermal stresses of orbital flight." The film recovery system posed equally daunting challenges. Unlike communication satellites, which could transmit their information instantaneously via radio, photographic satellites required a method of returning physical film to Earth for processing and analysis. The solution that emerged seemed like something from a science fiction novel. The satellite would eject a capsule containing exposed film. That capsule would plummet through the atmosphere protected by a heat shield, deploy a parachute at a predetermined altitude, and be caught in mid-air by specially equipped aircraft, using techniques borrowed from circus performers. Every aspect of this process required technological innovations that pushed the limits of 1950s engineering. The capsule needed a heat shield that could protect delicate film from temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit during atmospheric re-entry. The parachute system needed to deploy with perfect reliability at precisely the right altitude and velocity. The recovery aircraft needed to snag the parachute with a hook system while both the capsule and the aircraft were moving at high speed through three-dimensional space. The Corona program operated from a facility that embodied the intersection of cutting-edge technology and absolute secrecy. Located in Sunnyvale, California, the Lockheed Missiles and Space Company's Skunk Works division had already earned a legendary reputation for developing the U-2 spy plane under conditions of unprecedented security and innovation. Kelly Johnson, the genius engineer who led Skunk Works, approached satellite development with the same methodology that had produced the U-2, small teams of exceptional engineers working with minimal bureaucracy and maximum creativity. The Corona team numbered fewer than 200 people, but each was selected for unique expertise in technologies that didn't yet exist. The facility itself was designed like a cathedral of secrecy. Engineers entered through multiple security checkpoints, surrendered all personal items that could record or transmit information, and worked in windowless rooms where every conversation was monitored and every document was classified beyond the level of nuclear weapons data. Family members were told only that their loved ones worked on advanced aerospace projects. The psychological strain of maintaining such secrecy for years at a time would later be recognized as one of the program's hidden costs. But within those secure walls, innovation flourished at a pace that astonished even the engineers creating it. Problems that seemed impossible in the morning often had elegant solutions by evening. The collaborative intensity of the program created a feedback loop of creativity that accelerated technological development beyond anything in American industrial history. Jim Plummer, a young optical engineer recruited directly from MIT, later described the experience as living inside the future. The technologies being developed for Corona, miniaturized electronics, precision guidance systems, automated data processing, would eventually transform civilian industries ranging from commercial photography to computer manufacturing. But in 1958 and 1959, these innovations existed only in the classified laboratories where America's space spies were learning to see through the Iron Curtain. What distinguished Corona from traditional intelligence operations was not just its technology, but its fundamental philosophy of information gathering. Human intelligence relied on the cultivation of individual sources, each with their own motivations, limitations, and biases. Satellite intelligence promised something unprecedented in the history of espionage: objective, comprehensive, and repeatable observations of enemy capabilities. A human agent might observe a Soviet missile base and report that it contained approximately 20 launchers. A satellite could photograph the same base and provide an exact count of launchers, support vehicles, personnel buildings, security perimeters, and supply routes. More importantly, the satellite could return to photograph the same base weeks or months later, providing precise measurements of changes in capability and deployment patterns. This transition from subjective human observation to objective mechanical documentation represented a philosophical revolution in intelligence work. For the first time in history, nations could know with mathematical precision what their enemies possessed and where those capabilities were located. The implications extended far beyond military planning to include arms control verification, strategic stability, and the basic conduct of international relations. Allen Dulles, the CIA director who authorized Corona, understood that satellite intelligence would transform not just how America gathered information about its enemies, but how it thought about security in the nuclear age. "We're not just building cameras," he told President Eisenhower during one of their regular briefings on the program's progress. "We're building the foundation for a new kind of diplomacy, one based on verified facts rather than uncertain assumptions." The path from theory to successful operation proved far more challenging than even the most pessimistic estimates had predicted. Corona's first launch, designated Discoverer 1, took place on February 28, 1959, from Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. The satellite achieved orbit successfully, but its camera system failed to operate, and the film recovery capsule was never recovered. Discoverer 2, launched 3 months later, suffered a guidance system malfunction that sent it tumbling uselessly through space. Discoverer 3's recovery capsule deployed its parachute correctly, but landed in the ocean instead of over the intended recovery zone. Discoverer 4's camera worked perfectly, but the capsule's heat shield failed during re-entry, destroying the film along with the capsule itself. Each failure was analyzed with the obsessive attention to detail that characterized the program. Teams of engineers dissected telemetry data, examined recovered components, and redesigned systems based on harsh lessons learned in the unforgiving environment of space. The psychological toll on the engineering teams was enormous. Years of work could be destroyed by a single failed component or miscalculated trajectory. But within each failure lay the seeds of eventual success. The camera optics were gradually perfected through iterative testing. The guidance systems became more reliable as engineers learned to account for the subtle gravitational and magnetic influences that affected satellite orbits. The recovery procedures were refined through practice and analysis until the mid-air capture of falling capsules became routine rather than miraculous. James Plummer, whose optical designs formed the heart of Corona's camera system, later compared the development process to learning to perform surgery by practicing on dying patients. The metaphor was apt. Each launch represented an irreplaceable opportunity to test systems that could only be fully validated in the hostile environment of space, and each failure meant months of additional development before the next attempt. On August 18, 1960, after 13 failures and nearly 2 years of frustrating setbacks, Corona finally achieved its first operational success. Discoverer 14 completed a successful orbital mission, photographed targets across the Soviet Union, ejected its film capsule on schedule, and delivered that capsule to recovery aircraft flying over the Pacific Ocean. The moment when CIA analysts first examined the recovered film marked a watershed in the history of espionage. The images were sharper and more detailed than anyone had dared hope. Soviet airfields appeared with crystalline clarity, showing not just the presence of aircraft but their specific types, configurations, and states of readiness. Missile installations that had been invisible to human intelligence were revealed in their entirety: launch pads, support facilities, storage bunkers, and security perimeters. Most remarkably, the photographs covered territory that would have taken human agents years to survey, even if such agents could have operated freely within the closed Soviet system. In a single orbital pass, Corona had gathered more visual intelligence about Soviet military capabilities than all of America's human assets combined had collected in the previous decade. Arthur Lundahl, who headed the CIA's new National Photographic Interpretation Center, described the impact of those first successful images in terms that revealed their revolutionary significance. We had entered a new age of intelligence. For the first time in history, we could see our enemy's capabilities with our own eyes, unfiltered by the limitations and biases of human observers. But even as American intelligence analysts celebrated their unprecedented view of Soviet military installations, they had no idea that their triumph was still invisible to their enemies. The KGB remained focused on traditional human intelligence operations, confident that their elaborate security measures could protect Soviet secrets from foreign observation. What they didn't know yet was that protection from human observation had become irrelevant. High above their heads, American satellites were opening mechanical eyes that could see through camouflage, penetrate security perimeters, and record images that would transform the Soviet Union's most closely guarded secrets into precisely detailed intelligence files stored in American archives. The success of Discoverer 14 unleashed a rapid expansion of America's space-based intelligence capabilities. Launch followed launch in quick succession as the Corona program matured from experimental prototype to operational intelligence system. Each mission returned thousands of photographs covering millions of square miles of Soviet territory. The cumulative effect was a comprehensive photographic survey of America's primary adversary that exceeded the wildest dreams of traditional intelligence planners. The photographs revealed secrets that human agents never could have discovered. Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles, which KGB security had hidden beneath elaborate camouflage and deception programs, appeared clearly in satellite images. Nuclear submarine construction facilities, buried deep within restricted military zones, were mapped with precision that allowed American analysts to track the production of individual vessels. Air defense systems, carefully concealed from ground-based observation, were cataloged and analyzed for vulnerabilities that would prove crucial in future military planning. But perhaps most significantly, the photographs revealed what didn't exist as clearly as what did. For years, American military planners had based their strategies on worst-case assumptions about Soviet capabilities. Intelligence estimates had credited the USSR with bomber forces, missile deployments, and naval capabilities that existed primarily in the imaginations of Western analysts who had no way to verify their assumptions. Corona's systematic photographic surveillance replaced those assumptions with verifiable facts. The much-feared bomber gap that had driven American military spending throughout the 1950s proved to be largely fictional. The Soviet Union possessed far fewer strategic bombers than intelligence estimates had suggested. Similarly, the missile gap that had influenced the 1960 presidential election was revealed to be based on dramatic overestimates of Soviet ICBM deployments. This transition from assumption-based to evidence-based intelligence assessment would prove to have implications extending far beyond military planning. For the first time, American policymakers could make strategic decisions based on verified information about enemy capabilities, rather than uncertain estimates derived from fragmentary human intelligence reports. As 1960 drew to a close, American satellites had photographed virtually every significant military installation in the Soviet Union. The images filled warehouse-sized archives where teams of skilled interpreters worked around the clock to extract intelligence from the unprecedented flood of visual information. What they found would soon shatter the confidence of intelligence services around the world and rewrite the fundamental rules of international security. But in Moscow, the KGB's analysts remained unaware that their world had changed. They continued to operate according to the principles that had governed espionage for centuries: the patient cultivation of human sources, the careful protection of state secrets through physical security measures, the assumption that information could be controlled through the restriction of human access. They had no framework for understanding that security itself had been redefined by technologies operating beyond the reach of traditional counterintelligence methods. The Iron Curtain that had successfully blocked human penetration for more than a decade had become transparent to mechanical eyes orbiting 100 miles above the Earth's surface. The reckoning was coming, though they didn't know it yet. Soon, a single photograph, one frame among thousands returned by America's space-based cameras, would expose what the KGB had believed was their most closely guarded secret. And when that moment arrived, the laughter that had once echoed through the conference rooms of Lubyanka would be replaced by a silence more profound than any in the long history of espionage. The age of mechanical omniscience had begun, and the old masters of human intelligence were about to discover that, in the realm of space-based surveillance, human intelligence was no longer sufficient to protect the secrets upon which national security depended. May 1, 1960. Captain Francis Gary Powers guided his U-2 spy plane through the thin atmosphere 14 miles above the Soviet Union, following a flight path that would take him over some of the USSR's most sensitive military installations. The mission, designated Operation Grand Slam, represented the culmination of 4 years of successful U-2 overflights that had provided American intelligence with unprecedented access to Soviet secrets. Powers had completed similar missions dozens of times before, flying at altitudes where Soviet interceptors couldn't reach and surface-to-air missiles couldn't function effectively. The U-2's extreme operating ceiling and sophisticated camera systems had made it virtually invulnerable to Soviet air defenses, allowing American pilots to photograph military installations with impunity, while Soviet radar operators watched helplessly from far below. But this flight would be different. As Powers approached the industrial city of Sverdlovsk, a new Soviet surface-to-air missile, the S-75 Dvina, unknown to American intelligence, streaked upward through the stratosphere. The missile's proximity-fused warhead detonated close enough to Powers' aircraft to disable its controls and send it tumbling toward the Earth in a flat spin that prevented the pilot from activating the U-2's self-destruct mechanism. Hours later, Soviet forces captured both the wreckage of the most sophisticated spy plane in the American arsenal and its pilot, who had survived the crash with his aircraft's classified camera equipment intact. For the KGB, the capture represented the greatest counterintelligence victory in their organization's history. For the first time, They had physical proof of American aerial espionage and a living pilot who could be interrogated about the scope and methods of U.S. intelligence operations. In the conference rooms of Lubyanka, senior KGB officers celebrated with the quiet satisfaction of professionals who had achieved something unprecedented. Colonel Petrov, whose mockery of space-based intelligence had set the tone for Soviet attitudes toward American reconnaissance efforts, felt vindicated by the U-2's downing. "This proves what we've always known," he told his assembled staff. "American intelligence depends on primitive methods: aircraft that can be shot down, pilots who can be captured, equipment that can be analyzed and defeated." The mood in Moscow was triumphant. Premier Nikita Khrushchev orchestrated the U-2 incident's revelation with theatrical precision, first announcing the downing of an American aircraft, then revealing the pilot's survival when President Eisenhower claimed the plane was conducting weather research, and finally displaying the wreckage and classified equipment to demonstrate the scope of American espionage efforts. For the KGB's leadership, the incident seemed to validate their fundamental approach to counterintelligence. Physical security had worked. The most advanced American spy plane had been brought down by Soviet technology, and the elaborate security measures protecting sensitive installations had forced the Americans to resort to illegal overflights that could be detected, intercepted, and prevented. But what they didn't realize, what none of them could have anticipated, was that the U-2's downing had made their greatest vulnerability more acute rather than less. The destruction of America's most visible intelligence program had accelerated the development of capabilities that were completely invisible to Soviet detection and completely immune to Soviet countermeasures. High above the celebrations in Moscow, Corona satellites were already returning photographs that provided better intelligence than the U-2 had ever collected. The loss of aerial reconnaissance had been more than compensated by space-based systems that operated beyond the reach of surface-to-air missiles, immune to interception, invisible to detection, and impossible to prevent. Major Vladimir Kozlov, the young KGB officer who had been among the most skeptical of American space fantasies, analyzed the captured U-2 equipment with particular interest. The aircraft's sophisticated camera systems impressed him with their technical sophistication, but also convinced him that such complex equipment could only operate from platforms that remained within Earth's atmosphere. "Look at these systems," he explained to a gathering of technical specialists brought in to analyze the captured equipment. "The camera alone weighs more than 500 pounds and requires constant adjustment for focus, exposure, and stabilization. The environmental controls needed to keep the film from freezing or overheating fill half the aircraft's fuselage. You cannot put equipment like this in space. The technical challenges are impossible, and even if they could be solved, the weight and power requirements would exceed any rocket's payload capacity." His analysis seemed irrefutable, supported by the physical evidence of American reconnaissance technology spread across examination tables in Lubyanka's basement laboratories. But Kozlov's reasoning contained a fatal flaw. He was assuming that space-based cameras would use the same technologies as aircraft-based systems, when in fact American engineers had developed entirely new approaches to orbital photography that bore little resemblance to traditional aerial reconnaissance equipment. Through the summer and fall of 1960, KGB analysts began noticing anomalies in American intelligence assessments that couldn't be explained by any known collection methods. U.S. military publications contained references to Soviet weapons systems, with accuracy levels that seemed impossible given the limitations of human intelligence networks and the absence of aerial reconnaissance platforms following the U-2's downing. American negotiators in arms control discussions displayed knowledge of Soviet missile deployments that was suspiciously specific and seemingly current. CIA briefings to NATO allies contained details about Soviet military facilities that no human agent could have observed without being detected by the elaborate security systems surrounding such installations. Most troubling of all, American intelligence appeared to possess detailed knowledge of facilities that the KGB believed were completely invisible to foreign observation. Underground missile silos, camouflaged radar installations, and naval facilities located in restricted military zones hundreds of miles from any civilian population centers were being described in American intelligence reports with accuracy that implied direct observation. Colonel Petrov, tasked with investigating these intelligence anomalies, initially suspected a massive penetration of Soviet security by American agents. His teams launched an intensive counterintelligence investigation, searching for human sources who might have access to the kinds of comprehensive information that American intelligence appeared to possess. But the investigation revealed nothing. Security reviews found no evidence of American agents with access to the installations being described in U.S. intelligence reports. Communication intercepts detected no suspicious transmissions that might indicate covert intelligence activities. Physical surveillance of suspected American intelligence officers revealed no contacts with potential Soviet sources. The absence of any human intelligence explanation for American knowledge created a disturbing puzzle that challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which Soviet counterintelligence operated. If the Americans weren't using human agents to collect this information, and they were no longer conducting aerial reconnaissance missions following the U-2 incident, how were they obtaining intelligence that appeared to be both current and comprehensive? Dr. Sergei Korolev, the chief designer of the Soviet space program, attended a classified briefing in late 1960 where KGB officials described the intelligence anomalies they had been observing. Korolev, whose engineering expertise had made the Soviet Union the world's leader in space technology, listened to the descriptions with growing alarm. Unlike the intelligence professionals in the room, Korolev understood both the theoretical possibilities and the practical realities of space-based reconnaissance. His teams had already considered using Soviet satellites for military reconnaissance, but had concluded that the technical challenges made such applications impractical with existing technology. But as he listened to the detailed descriptions of American intelligence capabilities, Korolev realized that the Americans might have solved problems that Soviet engineers had considered unsolvable. The precision and comprehensiveness of U.S. intelligence suggested collection methods that could only operate from orbital platforms with capabilities far exceeding anything in the Soviet space program. "Comrades," Korolev said during a pause in the briefing, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had sent the first artificial satellites into orbit, "I believe we have been looking in the wrong direction. The Americans may not be collecting this intelligence on Earth at all. They may be collecting it from space." The room fell silent as the implications of Korolev's assessment sank in. If American satellites were capable of photographing Soviet military installations with sufficient resolution to support the detailed intelligence assessments that had been observed, then the entire foundation of Soviet security had been compromised. Physical camouflage, which had protected sensitive installations from aerial observation, would be useless against satellites that could photograph the same targets repeatedly with different lighting conditions and seasonal variations. Security perimeters, which had prevented human agents from approaching critical facilities, provided no protection against cameras operating from orbit. Communication security, which had prevented the transmission of intelligence gathered by human sources, was irrelevant to collection methods that required no human presence at the target location. Within days of Korolev's assessment, Premier Khrushchev convened an emergency session of the Defense Council to address what was being described as the greatest intelligence crisis in Soviet history. The possibility that American satellites were systematically photographing Soviet military installations represented a fundamental shift in the balance of strategic intelligence that could undermine the USSR's entire national security strategy. Marshal Rodion Malinowski, the Soviet defense minister, outlined the scope of the potential threat in terms that revealed its unprecedented nature. If American space-based reconnaissance was as comprehensive as the intelligence anomalies suggested, then the United States possessed detailed knowledge of Soviet military capabilities that could be used to plan preemptive attacks, develop countermeasures against Soviet weapon systems, and negotiate from positions of overwhelming information superiority. More immediately, the possibility of American satellite surveillance meant that the elaborate deception and camouflage programs that protected Soviet military installations were not only ineffective but counterproductive. Resources that had been devoted to hiding installations from ground-based observation were worthless against overhead photography, and the very efforts to conceal military activities might actually make them more conspicuous to orbital observers. The psychological impact on Soviet leadership was profound. For more than a decade, The USSR had operated under the assumption that its closed society provided inherent protection against foreign intelligence collection. The Iron Curtain that prevented Western access to Soviet territory was supposed to ensure that American intelligence remained limited to fragmentary reports from human sources who could be detected, controlled, and eliminated by counterintelligence operations. But if American satellites could photograph Soviet territory with impunity, then the closed nature of Soviet society provided no protection at all. Indeed, it might have made the problem worse by creating a false sense of security that prevented Soviet leadership from taking appropriate defensive measures against collection methods they didn't understand. Khrushchev's response to the intelligence crisis was characteristically bold and typically Soviet. A crash program to develop space-based reconnaissance capabilities that could match or exceed American achievements. Within weeks of the Defense Council meeting, Soviet engineers were working around the clock to design, build, and launch satellites capable of photographing American military installations. The program, designated Zenit, represented the Soviet Union's first systematic attempt to develop space-based intelligence capabilities. But unlike the American Corona program, which had benefited from years of careful development and testing, Zenit was conceived as an emergency response to an immediate threat. The pressure to achieve rapid results forced Soviet engineers to take shortcuts that would later prove costly. More fundamentally, the Soviet approach to satellite reconnaissance was handicapped by the same assumptions that had led the KGB to dismiss American space-based intelligence as science fiction. Soviet engineers assumed that space-based cameras would need to use technologies similar to those employed in aircraft reconnaissance, leading to satellite designs that were heavier, more complex, and less reliable than their American counterparts. Dr. Dmitry Kozlov, who led the Zenit program's technical development, later described the challenge in terms that revealed its near impossibility. "We were trying to compress 5 years of American development into 5 months of Soviet crash programming. We were trying to solve problems we didn't fully understand using technologies we hadn't fully mastered under political pressures that made careful engineering impossible." The first Zenit satellite, launched in April 1961, suffered a guidance system failure that sent it tumbling uselessly through orbit. The second achieved stable flight but returned photographs so blurred that they provided no useful intelligence. The third's camera system failed completely, producing no images at all. Each failure was analyzed with the same obsessive attention to detail that had characterized American satellite development, but without the benefit of the iterative testing and development that had allowed Corona to learn from its mistakes. The Soviet program was handicapped by the need to achieve immediate success without the luxury of gradual improvement. As Soviet engineers struggled to develop effective space-based reconnaissance capabilities, KGB analysts worked to assess the damage that American satellite surveillance might have already caused to Soviet security. The task proved overwhelming. If American satellites had been photographing Soviet territory for months or years without detection, then virtually every aspect of Soviet military planning might have been compromised. Strategic missile deployments that had been positioned to ensure survivability against American attack might have been cataloged and targeted by American war planners. Nuclear submarine construction programs that had been hidden in restricted military zones might have been monitored from their inception to completion. Air defense systems that had been carefully positioned to protect against American bomber attacks might have been mapped and analyzed for vulnerabilities. The scope of potential intelligence compromise extended beyond military capabilities to include industrial facilities, transportation networks, and civilian infrastructure that could be targeted in wartime or analyzed for economic intelligence. If American satellites possessed the resolution and coverage that intelligence anomalies suggested, then they could provide comprehensive strategic intelligence about Soviet society that exceeded anything that human agents could collect, even under ideal conditions. Colonel Petrov, whose initial mockery of space-based intelligence had become a source of professional embarrassment, led a comprehensive assessment of potential intelligence losses. His team's conclusions were sobering. If American satellite reconnaissance was as effective as circumstantial evidence suggested, then the Soviet Union's strategic position had been fundamentally compromised. "We have been fighting an intelligence war using the weapons of the past," Petrov reported to his superiors, while our enemies have been fighting with the weapons of the future. We must assume that nothing we have done to protect our secrets has been effective, and everything we have done to conceal our capabilities has been observed, recorded, and analyzed. The realization that Soviet military secrets might have been exposed to American observation created a paranoia that infected every level of the Soviet defense establishment. Installation commanders who had been confident in their security measures suddenly questioned whether their elaborate camouflage and deception programs provided any protection at all. New construction projects were delayed while engineers debated whether traditional concealment methods were effective against overhead observation. Existing facilities were analyzed for vulnerabilities to satellite surveillance, leading to expensive renovation programs designed to defeat collection methods that were still poorly understood. The psychological impact proved as damaging as any intelligence compromise. Soviet military leaders who had operated with confidence in their ability to protect critical information found themselves second-guessing decisions about deployment patterns, facility locations, and operational procedures. The assumption that physical security could protect military secrets was replaced by the fear that everything was visible to American eyes in the sky. This paranoia was justified by emerging evidence of American intelligence capabilities that exceeded even the most pessimistic Soviet assessments. When President Kennedy authorized the Bay of Pigs invasion in early 1961, Soviet intelligence noticed that American planning appeared to be based on detailed knowledge of Cuban military capabilities that could only have been collected through systematic overhead reconnaissance. More troubling still, American intelligence seemed to possess current information about Soviet military activities that was being updated in real time. References to recent Soviet military exercises appeared in American intelligence briefings within days of their completion, suggesting collection capabilities that operated on a continuous rather than episodic basis. By the end of 1961, the KGB's attitude toward American space-based intelligence had undergone a complete transformation. The laughter that had once greeted reports of American space fantasies had been replaced by grim recognition of a technological superiority that threatened the foundation of Soviet security. The men who had built their careers on mastering human intelligence found themselves confronting a collection methodology that rendered traditional counterintelligence measures useless. Physical security, communication discipline, and operational security, the fundamental tools of intelligence protection, provided no defense against mechanical eyes that operated beyond the reach of human interference. Major Kozlov, whose skepticism about American satellite capabilities had influenced Soviet thinking for years, submitted a classified assessment that marked the end of an era in intelligence warfare. "We have entered a new age of espionage," he wrote, "in which the traditional advantages of closed societies have become irrelevant. Our enemies can now see what we do, when we do it, and where we do it, regardless of our efforts to maintain secrecy. We must assume that privacy itself has become obsolete." The implications of this assessment extended far beyond intelligence operations to include fundamental questions about Soviet society and governance. If American satellites could photograph Soviet territory with impunity, then the closed nature of Soviet society provided no protection against foreign observation. The Iron Curtain that had defined Soviet security for more than a decade had become transparent to mechanical eyes that no human counterintelligence operation could detect or defeat. But the most profound change was psychological. The confidence that had characterized Soviet intelligence operations for decades, the certainty that their society's closed nature provided inherent advantages in intelligence competition, had been shattered by the realization that their enemies had transcended the boundaries of terrestrial espionage entirely. The age of human intelligence was ending, and the age of mechanical omniscience had begun. By the time the KGB understood what had happened, American satellites had already rewritten the rules of international security, and the Cold War had moved into a realm where traditional espionage methods were no longer sufficient to protect the secrets upon which national survival depended. October 14, 1962. In a sterile photo interpretation facility beneath the CIA's headquarters at Langley, analyst Arthur Lundahl placed a magnifying glass over a black and white photograph that would change the course of history. The image, taken 2 days earlier by a U-2 reconnaissance aircraft flying over Cuba, showed something that Soviet leaders believed was invisible to American observation: medium-range ballistic missiles capable of delivering nuclear warheads to targets throughout the eastern United States. But this photograph was different from the thousands that had preceded it. Unlike the intelligence gathered through patient human networks or intercepted communications that might be dismissed as unreliable or incomplete, this image provided irrefutable visual proof of Soviet nuclear missiles being installed just 90 miles from American shores. For the first time in the Cold War, truth itself had become a weapon. President Kennedy's advisors gathered in the White House Situation Room to examine the photographs with the focused intensity of men who understood they were looking at evidence that could justify nuclear war or prevent it, depending on how that evidence was used. The images showed not just the missiles themselves, but their support equipment, launch facilities, and operational status. Intelligence that no human agent could have collected without being detected and eliminated by Soviet security forces. What made these photographs even more remarkable was their context within the broader revolution in American intelligence capabilities. By 1962, Corona satellites had been systematically photographing Soviet territory for more than 2 years, creating a comprehensive baseline of normal military activity against which any unusual deployment could be instantly recognized and analyzed. The Cuban missiles appeared in American intelligence assessments, not as isolated observations, but as anomalies within a global surveillance system that had cataloged virtually every significant military installation in the communist world. American analysts knew not just that Soviet missiles were in Cuba, but where they had come from, how they had been transported, and what supporting infrastructure was required for their operation. By the early 1960s, American space-based intelligence had evolved from an experimental program to a comprehensive surveillance system that operated with industrial efficiency and unprecedented scope. Corona satellites launched on regular schedules, photographed predetermined target lists, and returned their film to processing facilities where teams of skilled interpreters worked around the clock to extract intelligence from millions of square feet of imagery. The scale of this operation defied comprehension. A single Corona mission might photograph territory equivalent to the combined area of several European countries, capturing images of thousands of military installations, industrial facilities, and transportation networks in sufficient detail to support tactical as well as strategic intelligence requirements. The cumulative effect was a photographic archive that documented the military capabilities of America's adversaries with precision that had never before been possible in human history. But quantity was only part of the revolution. The quality of satellite photography had improved dramatically as engineers solved the technical challenges of space-based reconnaissance. By 1962, Corona cameras could distinguish objects smaller than automobiles from altitudes exceeding 100 miles, providing ground resolution that rivaled the best aerial photography while covering vastly larger areas with complete immunity from enemy countermeasures. This combination of comprehensive coverage and high resolution created intelligence capabilities that transcended the traditional limitations of espionage. American analysts could track the construction of individual buildings at Soviet military facilities, monitor the deployment patterns of mobile missile systems, and observe the testing procedures for new weapon systems as they occurred. The closed nature of communist societies, which had once protected sensitive activities from foreign observation, became irrelevant when those activities were visible to cameras operating beyond the reach of terrestrial security measures. James Schlesinger, who would later become CIA director, described the impact of systematic satellite surveillance in terms that captured its revolutionary significance. We had achieved something unprecedented in intelligence history: the ability to observe our enemies continuously rather than episodically, comprehensively rather than selectively, and objectively rather than through the filter of human sources with their inevitable limitations and biases. The Cuban Missile Crisis revealed both the power and the complexity of intelligence capabilities that approached omniscience. American satellites and reconnaissance aircraft had detected the Soviet missiles in Cuba within days of their arrival, providing policymakers with accurate information about their locations, capabilities, and operational status. This intelligence advantage gave President Kennedy options that no previous president had possessed: the ability to confront Soviet deception with irrefutable proof of what American cameras had observed. But perfect information created its own challenges. Traditional diplomacy had operated within a framework of uncertainty where both sides could maintain plausible deniability about their activities and intentions. When President Kennedy confronted Soviet Premier Khrushchev with photographic evidence of missiles in Cuba, he eliminated the ambiguity that had previously allowed nations to retreat from confrontational positions without acknowledging deception or admitting failure. The photographs forced both superpowers into a crisis where traditional diplomatic solutions were complicated by the precision of American intelligence. Khrushchev could not deny the existence of missiles that American cameras had documented in exhaustive detail. Kennedy could not ignore a threat that American intelligence had revealed with mathematical certainty. The very accuracy of satellite reconnaissance had created a situation where both leaders found their options constrained by the clarity of what American eyes in the sky had observed. This paradox would prove to be one of the defining characteristics of intelligence competition in the space age. Better information did not necessarily lead to better decisions, and comprehensive surveillance sometimes created crises that might have been avoided through the strategic ignorance that had characterized earlier eras of international relations. The Cuban Missile Crisis marked the end of Soviet illusions about American space-based intelligence capabilities. The precision with which American officials described Soviet activities in Cuba made clear that U.S. satellite surveillance had achieved the comprehensive coverage and high resolution that KGB analysts had hoped was technically impossible. Soviet response to this intelligence revolution took multiple forms, none of them entirely successful. The Zenit reconnaissance satellite program was expanded and accelerated, but continued to lag behind American capabilities due to technological limitations and the engineering shortcuts that had been necessitated by crash development schedules. By 1963, Soviet satellites were returning usable imagery, but the quality and quantity of their intelligence product remained inferior to American systems that had benefited from years of careful development and testing. More promising was the Soviet development of anti-satellite weapons designed to blind American space-based intelligence by destroying the satellites themselves. These weapons represented a logical response to a collection methodology that operated beyond the reach of traditional countermeasures. But they also threatened to escalate intelligence competition into actual space warfare, with consequences that neither superpower fully understood. The psychological impact of confirmed American satellite surveillance capabilities was perhaps more significant than any technological response. Soviet military planners were forced to assume that all of their activities were visible to American observation, leading to changes in deployment patterns, construction techniques, and operational procedures that were expensive, complex, and not always effective. Marshal Andrei Grechko, who became Soviet defense minister in 1967, later described the period as one of strategic nakedness, in which traditional concepts of military secrecy had become obsolete. "We learned to operate under the assumption that American eyes were always watching," he recalled. "This changed not just how we deployed our forces, but how we thought about security itself." By the mid-1960s, the success of American space-based reconnaissance had inspired similar programs in other nations with advanced space capabilities. France launched its first reconnaissance satellite in 1965, followed by China in 1970 and other nations in subsequent decades. The technologies that had once provided the United States with unique intelligence advantages gradually became available to any nation with sufficient technical sophistication and financial resources. This proliferation of space-based intelligence capabilities created a world where more nations possessed godlike surveillance abilities than ever before, but where the relative advantages of such capabilities were diminished by their widespread availability. The intelligence revolution that had begun with American satellites viewing Soviet territory evolved into a global surveillance system where multiple nations could observe each other's activities with unprecedented precision and scope. The implications extended beyond military intelligence to include arms control verification, environmental monitoring, and commercial applications that transformed space-based reconnaissance from a classified government capability to a routine aspect of international relations. The same technologies that had been developed to penetrate Soviet military secrecy found civilian applications in agriculture, urban planning, natural resource exploration, and disaster response. But the fundamental transformation remained unchanged. The world had moved from an era where nations could maintain secrets through physical isolation to an age where privacy itself had become a relative concept subject to the technical capabilities of whoever possessed the most sophisticated surveillance systems. As satellite reconnaissance matured from experimental technology to routine intelligence capability, the moral and ethical implications of mechanical omniscience became subjects of serious debate within the intelligence community. The ability to observe enemy activities with perfect clarity and complete immunity from detection raised fundamental questions about the nature of privacy, sovereignty, and the conduct of international relations in an age of technological surveillance. Some officials argued that satellite reconnaissance made the world safer by eliminating the uncertainties and misperceptions that had historically led to military conflicts. When nations could observe each other's military capabilities with precision, they could make more accurate assessments of threats and opportunities, reducing the likelihood of wars based on miscalculation or incomplete information. Others worried that perfect intelligence created pressures for preemptive action that might actually increase rather than decrease the probability of conflict. If satellites could reveal the exact locations and capabilities of enemy weapon systems, military planners might be tempted to launch attacks designed to eliminate those capabilities before they could be used defensively. The debate was complicated by the recognition that satellite surveillance, despite its apparent objectivity, was still subject to human interpretation and analysis. Mechanical eyes might see everything, but human minds still had to determine what those observations meant and what actions they justified. Alan Dulles, reflecting on the intelligence revolution he had helped to create, captured the ambiguity of these concerns. We sought the ability to see our enemies clearly, and we achieved that goal beyond our most optimistic expectations. But clarity of observation does not automatically produce clarity of understanding, and the ability to see everything does not necessarily make us wiser about what we should do with what we see. By the end of the 1960s, space-based reconnaissance had fundamentally transformed the practice of international intelligence competition. The patient human networks that had once provided the primary source of information about enemy capabilities had been supplemented and in many cases replaced by mechanical systems that could collect intelligence on scales and with precision that human agents could never achieve. The KGB, which had begun the decade by laughing at American space fantasies, had been forced to completely restructure their approach to intelligence operations. Traditional human intelligence remained important for collecting information about intentions and decision-making processes that satellites could not observe. But the basic task of assessing enemy military capabilities had been revolutionized by technologies that operated beyond the reach of human counterintelligence methods. The irony was profound and complete. The Soviet Union, which had initiated the space age with Sputnik's launch in 1957, had inadvertently enabled the development of American intelligence capabilities that eliminated many of the traditional advantages of closed societies in intelligence competition. By proving that artificial satellites were technically feasible, the USSR had inspired the development of space-based reconnaissance systems that made their own secrecy transparent to mechanical observation. The men who had once gathered in smoke-filled conference rooms to mock the impossibility of space-based intelligence had been forced to acknowledge that they had been wrong about one of the most fundamental transformations in the history of espionage. Their laughter had been replaced by the recognition that they were living in a world where the sky itself had eyes, and those eyes belonged to their enemies. The age of omniscience had arrived, and it had arrived so completely that it was no longer possible to imagine international relations without the assumption that everything was visible to someone with sufficient technology and the will to look. The Cold War had moved into space, and it would never return to Earth. Moscow, 1975. In the same conference room where KGB analysts had once laughed at reports of American space fantasies, Colonel Petrov sat alone with a classified assessment that documented the complete transformation of intelligence competition in the space age. Now, in his final months before retirement, the veteran intelligence officer who had initially dismissed satellite reconnaissance as science fiction was tasked with writing the definitive analysis of how fundamentally espionage had changed since mechanical eyes had opened above the Earth. The document before him contained statistics that would have seemed impossible 18 years earlier. American satellites had photographed virtually every square mile of Soviet territory multiple times, creating an archive of imagery that documented changes in military capabilities, industrial development, and civilian infrastructure with unprecedented precision and scope. Similar Soviet capabilities, developed in desperate response to American achievements, had eliminated many of the traditional advantages that closed societies had enjoyed in intelligence competition. But the numbers told only part of the story. The real transformation was philosophical. The recognition that privacy itself had become a relative concept subject to the technical capabilities of whoever possessed the most sophisticated surveillance systems. Nations could no longer protect secrets through physical isolation or human security measures when those secrets were visible to cameras operating beyond the reach of terrestrial countermeasures. Petrov wrote in his final assessment, "We believed that nothing could see through the Iron Curtain, because we measured visibility by human limitations. We failed to anticipate that our enemies would transcend those limitations entirely by moving intelligence collection beyond the boundaries of Earth itself. In our arrogance, we assumed that what was invisible to men would remain invisible forever." The transformation of intelligence competition through space-based reconnaissance had created paradoxes that neither superpower had fully anticipated. American satellites had achieved the comprehensive surveillance of Soviet territory that CIA planners had envisioned, but this intelligence superiority had not translated into the strategic advantages that had been expected. Perfect information about enemy capabilities had made some aspects of international relations more stable. Both superpowers could assess each other's military strength with precision, reducing the likelihood of conflicts based on miscalculation or incomplete intelligence. But mechanical omniscience had also created new pressures for preemptive action and eliminated the ambiguity that had traditionally allowed nations to retreat from confrontational positions without acknowledging deception or failure. The Cuban Missile Crisis had demonstrated both the power and the limitations of space-based intelligence. American satellites had detected Soviet missiles in Cuba and provided policymakers with accurate information about their capabilities and locations. But the very precision of this intelligence had eliminated diplomatic options that might have allowed both superpowers to avoid a crisis that brought the world closer to nuclear war than it had ever been before or since. Dr. James Schlesinger, reflecting on his experience as CIA director during the height of the satellite reconnaissance era, captured the ambiguity of intelligence omniscience. "We achieved the ability to see everything our enemies did, but we discovered that seeing everything did not automatically make us wiser about what we should do with what we saw. Perfect intelligence created perfect responsibility. When you know exactly what your enemies are capable of, you can no longer claim ignorance as an excuse for inaction or miscalculation." By the 1970s, the technologies that had once provided unique American advantages in space-based reconnaissance were becoming available to other nations with advanced industrial capabilities. France, China, India, and eventually dozens of other countries developed satellite systems capable of photographing territory anywhere on Earth, with resolution sufficient for military intelligence purposes. This proliferation had transformed space-based reconnaissance from a rare capability possessed by superpowers to a routine aspect of international relations available to any nation with sufficient resources and technical expertise. Commercial satellite imagery, derived from technologies originally developed for military intelligence, became available to news organizations, academic researchers, and private citizens who could observe military activities that had once been among the most closely guarded secrets in the world. The implications extended far beyond intelligence competition to include arms control verification, environmental monitoring, and humanitarian applications that had never been envisioned by the engineers who developed the first reconnaissance satellites. The same cameras that had been designed to count Soviet missiles found civilian applications in monitoring deforestation, tracking natural disasters, and documenting human rights violations in remote regions of the world. But the fundamental transformation remained unchanged. The world had moved permanently from an era where nations could maintain complete secrecy about their activities to an age where privacy was subject to the technical capabilities of whoever possessed the most sophisticated surveillance systems. The assumption that some activities could remain hidden from foreign observation, an assumption that had governed international relations throughout human history, had become obsolete. The revolution in space-based intelligence had human consequences that extended beyond its impact on international relations and military planning. The engineers, analysts, and operators who had created and managed satellite reconnaissance systems had worked for decades under security restrictions that isolated them from their families, their communities, and often from any recognition of their achievements. Arthur Lundahl, who had built the CIA's photographic interpretation capability from a small office to a major intelligence organization, retired without ever being publicly acknowledged for his role in transforming American national security. James Plummer, whose optical innovations had made high-resolution satellite photography possible, worked for 30 years under cover stories that prevented him from discussing his professional achievements with anyone outside the intelligence community. The psychological costs of such secrecy were enormous, but largely invisible. Marriages failed under the strain of maintaining classified identities. Children grew up not knowing what their parents did for a living. Professional achievements that might have brought recognition and advancement in civilian careers remained forever classified, known only to small communities of security-cleared individuals. But these personal sacrifices had contributed to technological achievements that transformed human civilization's relationship with its own planet. For the first time in history, human beings possessed the ability to observe the entire surface of Earth on a continuous basis, creating possibilities for environmental monitoring, disaster response, and resource management that previous generations could never have imagined. The same technologies that had been developed to penetrate enemy secrets had evolved into tools for understanding climate change, tracking urban development, monitoring agricultural productivity, and documenting the human impact on natural systems. Space-based reconnaissance had become space-based science, with implications that extended far beyond the military applications that had motivated its original development. As the 1970s drew to a close, it had become clear that space-based surveillance represented not just a temporary technological advantage but a permanent transformation in the human condition. The mechanical eyes that had first opened above Earth in the late 1950s had evolved into a comprehensive system of observation that made privacy a relative concept and secrecy a temporary condition. Future generations would grow up in a world where the assumption that some activities could remain hidden from observation was as obsolete as the assumption that human flight was impossible had been for previous generations. Satellite surveillance had become so routine and comprehensive that it was taken for granted, like electricity or telecommunications, a background capability that enabled modern civilization, but was rarely noticed by those who benefited from it. The KGB analysts who had once laughed at American space fantasies had been succeeded by intelligence professionals who assumed that everything was visible to someone with sufficient technology and motivation. The transformation was complete. Space-based reconnaissance had evolved from an impossible dream to an unavoidable reality. Standing beneath the night sky that had once seemed empty to human observation, a new generation of intelligence officers understood that the stars themselves had become platforms for human technology. The darkness that had once hidden human activities from distant observation was now filled with mechanical eyes that never slept, never blinked, and never stopped recording the activities of the civilization that had created them. In the end, the story of space-based reconnaissance was a story about the limits of human imagination and the consequences of technological transcendence. The Soviet intelligence professionals who had dismissed satellite surveillance as science fiction had been victims of their own expertise. Their deep understanding of traditional intelligence methods had blinded them to possibilities that lay beyond the boundaries of human experience. They had been right about the technical challenges involved in space-based reconnaissance. The engineering problems were enormous, the costs were staggering, and the probability of failure was high. What they had failed to anticipate was that some challenges are so important that they justify any effort required to solve them, and some capabilities are so valuable that they justify any cost required to achieve them. The Americans had succeeded not because they were smarter or more capable than their Soviet counterparts, but because they had been willing to attempt something that seemed impossible, and to persist through failures that might have discouraged less motivated competitors. The patient work of thousands of engineers, analysts, and operators had transformed science fiction into strategic reality. But the final irony was deeper than technological success or failure. The space-based reconnaissance systems that had been developed to provide one nation with advantages over its enemies had ultimately made all nations more vulnerable to observation by anyone with sufficient technical capabilities. The omniscience that had once belonged exclusively to gods had become available to any civilization with rockets, cameras, and the will to see beyond the boundaries of its own planet. The KGB had thought space spying was science fiction until America's satellites started taking photographs. By the time they realized their mistake, the age of terrestrial secrecy had ended forever, and humanity had begun its permanent residence under the unblinking gaze of its own mechanical creations. They called it science fiction, until it made their secrets disappear.